be a high potential leader over the span of a career. And as many of you know, high potentials now receive most of the development resources in organizations and are, shall we say, given access to opportunities that their peers don't receive. And so we were particularly intrigued about, well, are there universal attributes that tend to set these individuals apart from their colleagues? And that was the fundamental question which we answer in this book. I think it's important to point out that we looked at individuals across industries, across different functions, and across levels and across generations. So what you're going to see here are the 5 dimensions which consistently appeared as differentiators over the long haul for high potentials. Let me begin with kind of the fundamental question, which is probably on the mind of many of you, which is how do organizations define what is high potential talent? And while there are many, many different variations on that theme, what Ellen and I concluded was that we can generalize across most organizations, and that is their ability to see you and I as stepping into a role that is 2 levels or more above the one we currently hold. And that becomes kind of the defining characteristic. Those of you who work in talent management and high potential development know that generally speaking, that works out to about 10 to 15% of the management pool in most organizations. And as you climb to the executive ranks, that percentage shrinks to anywhere from 5 to 2%. So we're talking about fairly special group of people, as you can appreciate. In some of your organizations, they will tell you that you're in that pool, and in many organizations, they will not. It's actually going to be a secret that's kind of kept within the walls of certain groups. And so the more interesting question that you might be having is, well, should we tell anybody whether there are high potentials? And when we looked at the organizations that don't tell you, what we discovered is that they had a couple concerns. The first was, well, what if you didn't make it to the list? Would you actually be demotivated and potentially start searching elsewhere, which is a concern because many of the strong individuals are kind of very solid B players. We don't want to lose. And so there's an issue of motivation. The second thing is that in companies where the cultures are very relational, it's highly collaborative, there are fears that if we're too transparent, it might create unhealthy internal competition. I want to beat you out to be on that list. The third were concerns that your expectations very quickly might become unrealistic once you discover you're a high potential. And so you expect to be moved faster, which you might be, but you might not be. And you expect to move upwards. And some of your assignments actually might be lateral, which are designed to develop you rather than increase the size of your title. And the final thing is that many organizations have people in a kind of a gray zone. They sit on the border of actually being high potentials, but there's some important question marks. And would my organization be hesitant now to make those borderline bets, given the fact that it's public knowledge as to who sits on that list? So those are the reasons why you might not be told. That said, you'll get a lot of clues that you're potentially on that list by being invited to special events that you notice your peers have not been invited to. You might have a lunch with your CEO that you realize there are only 2 other people at that lunch. You might be sent to a fast-track leadership development program. And you notice that you get special projects that your peers don't. So even in the organizations where it is not transparent, there are many clues as to the fact that you might be on that list. So what's my point of view after this project? Well, I think you should be told that transparency in this age is valued. Younger generations expect it. But there's a caveat about whether to tell or not. I think only systems that are very dynamic should be very transparent. And by dynamic, I mean that you actually not only can get into the pool, but if you fall out of the pool, you can get yourself back in. So we begin to address the motivational issue. This also is very important in an age where people are highly mobile, particularly our most promising talent. And this sends a clear message that you're valued and that we want to hold on to you. So I'm for transparency, provided the system is reevaluating individuals with great frequency, and you have just as much probability of getting back on the list if you fall out versus the other one. So let's say a word or two about potential and why assessing it is literally a crapshoot. As you can probably all appreciate, you may have been in the shoes where you didn't get promoted, and you looked around and said to yourself, well, how in the world did that person get into that opportunity? I'm actually much better than they are. So the systems are imperfect despite several decades of working at assessments and trying to hone managers' skill at assessing their own individuals. And so I think it's important to acknowledge up front that there are a lot of flaws in a system that strives to be accurate. So number one, bosses tend to be the primary assessor and designator. And as you can appreciate, bosses are terribly human. They have biases and they're very subjective. And depending upon whether there's great chemistry and depending upon whether you help the boss succeed, you could be on or off that list. You, as an individual, are in constant evolution. And many years ago, I had an opportunity to meet the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And I said, what have you learned about talent and talent development? And he said, well, you know, I think probably I've learned that you can't always get it right. He said, we'll take a captain who looks extremely promising, has a strong track record. We'll promote them based on that record. And they'll actually prove to be fairly mediocre or average at the next level up. On the other hand, I've had captains who weren't in the top 10 or 15%, but somebody took a bet on them, and they stepped them up into the next role, and they proved to be an enormously successful leader. And I think to some extent that recognizes the fact that you and I are not only in constant evolution, but there are kind of contextual dimensions which can't be fully appreciated or understood, and I'll talk to that in just a minute. The other question is potential for what exactly? Is it potential to be basically the head of a group of scientists? Or is it the potential to be a general manager running a very dynamic technology group that's constantly being threatened by new innovations? Two very different kinds of roles, two very different kinds of backgrounds are required. So the term itself is somewhat elusive and has to be tied to the roles you're thinking about ahead. And then finally, assessment tools have their limits. While there's an enormous industry now built around assessment tools, they often take people out of context. And so in this particular project, we were looking at a group of individuals who had just gone to a CEO assessment center. And so this was to look at about 30 high potentials in a Fortune 100 organization and determine who in that pool had the highest probability of taking over the CEO role in a 5 to 10 year horizon from today. The individual who ranked number one on the assessment, I was able to watch actually be fired within a year later. The main reason he was fired wasn't because he wasn't an outstanding participant in the assessment, because he clearly was. It was because he violated several important cultural rules of the organization that he was in. And so his skill at assessment and simulations out of the context of a strong culture actually were not very telling about his ability to one day be CEO. So assessment tools have severe limits. And I think it goes back to the core dilemma, which is we really don't know how well you're going to perform in roles that you've never had and with demands that you may never have experienced. And so we are taking a crapshoot with you in terms of, will you be able to rise to the occasion, and potentially will your organization be there to help you in the learning demands in those roles? Because that actually proves to be a factor as well. For example, the role of the boss. So potential is subjective. That said, every year organizations are asked, managers are asked to assess who are my top talent. And what we discovered was that there tended to be 5 differentiators of high potential talent. Again, these were quite consistent across industries, across levels, and across functions. So here they are. Number 1 was what we call situation sensing. Now, this is very specific to situation sensing your superior. In a moment, I'll talk more about this, but in your early career, your boss is the number 1 assessor and therefore the number 1 designator. In organizations that have fairly sophisticated talent management systems, there will be others and there will be other assessment tools that are used. But generally speaking, in most organizations, the boss is the designator. So your ability to read your boss quickly and make necessary adaptations quickly, determine whether or not you will be seen as having potential in their eyes. And so the number 1 dimension really addresses this issue of the subjectivity and the fact that the boss, like every boss, is different from one another. And your ability to be versatile and adapting to the many different bosses you will face without compromising on your core values and without compromising on ethical issues becomes the kind of foundational X factor. Number 2 is what we call talent accelerating, and talent accelerating is built on the premise that your potential is only as good as the potential of the people who work for you. And what we found is that those who tended to succeed over the long haul tended to be strong at developing, assessing, rewarding talent. In other words, their own teams and their own organizations. As we like to say, you basically stand on the shoulders of many others. Number 3 is career piloting, and career piloting has to do with the ability to be highly adaptive as you're moving across roles. Generally speaking, high potentials are moved at a rate of roughly 1 to 2 to 3 years at a cycle, but they're moved often laterally across very different functions, and they'll be given increasingly very challenging, demanding projects and roles that the organization has to tackle. So your ability to be a very adaptive, effective change agent becomes critical as you reach this more mid and then senior levels. The 4th quality is called complexity translating, and Ellen and I, we intuitively had a sense there was something, but we couldn't put our finger on it at first. But I kept seeing in interviews and observations the fact that as individuals reached the mid and then upper levels of the organization, they tended to be very good at translation. They could take complex issues and simplify them in the right ways for audiences. But more importantly, they knew how to simplify those complex issues in the right frame for board members, which would be a different framing for the CEO, which would be a different framing for peers, which would be a different framing for their subordinates. So they not only had the ability to translate, but they knew how to translate and reframe the issue depending upon the group that they were addressing. And this helped basically the different stakeholders take the right decisions or understand issues to then take the right decisions. The final dimension is catalytic learning. Many of you are familiar with the term learning agility, which has been in the vocabulary of human resources for quite some time, which is the ability to be flexible in your learning and recognize that you do need to be flexible. But catalytic learning is has a different quality or nuance to it. It is important to be flexible, but it's as important to implement your learnings. And what we saw that high potentials did that differentiated themselves from their peers was that they had strong learning orientations that they quickly turned into thoughtful actions and initiatives. And that's the catalyst, that insights were then turned into initiatives and actions. And that proves to be foundational for the other 4 X factors, that they are catalytic learners about their bosses, catalytic learners about the talent they lead, catalytic learners about the assignments they're given, and catalytic learners about the complex issues and environments into which they're thrown. And so that is the base attribute of high potentials. So let's begin with situation sensing. And this, as I said, is foundational because it's the boss who gets to be your primary assessor in your career. And the problem with that is that every boss is going to be different. And what we discovered was that high potentials basically excel because they help propel their boss's success. They tend to think at the level of their own boss or their boss's boss. They often demonstrate initiative that went way beyond the expectations of a superior, and that usually solved an emerging organizational challenge. And then on other occasions, we saw the high potentials taking off the plate of their bosses things that the boss didn't like to do, but the high potential often was good at. Now, the reason you're seeing a signature here, though, is the primary way they differentiated themselves was by focusing on the signature tasks of their bosses. So, like any good subordinate, like myself, you'd have to have a lot of daily work that you do. But the high potentials had a keen reading of the tasks that would propel their superior, the tasks that were the top priorities for their superior. And so we distinguish in the book between what are called core tasks and signature tasks. And in the book, we talk at length about how they're different from one another. But to give you a sense of what a signature task might be, it could be something that is a role, a project that's highly visible to the organization, and there are clear, measurable outcomes. You might be put in charge of delivering a new product, which is critical to growing a new segment of the market. You might be put in charge of the overhaul or turnaround of a existing process, but you take it to the next level. There might be a client that is the second or first largest client of the organization. The organization's in trouble with that client, and you turn it around. But by the way, you and your boss are both responsible for that. So one of the things which great high potentials do is they very quickly figure out what are the signature tasks of my boss and how am I going to help them achieve that. The second area that's important is understanding the stylistic imperatives of your boss. And by this, we mean not so much tasks or projects the boss has, but what they believe style-wise is important to a person's success or to teamwork. And so a classic might be, which we saw in several of our research examples, was starting meetings on time. So for you and I, that may not mean much, but for some of us, it's actually a very important sign of respect. People have to wait otherwise. You can't start the meeting. So within a few weeks, you understood what were the style imperatives, and you made certain to match or align your behavior to those. So maybe the boss actually preferred that you deliver everything before a meeting in a one-page summary. You quickly figured that out, and rather than bring a deck of 40 slides, which in this case the boss actually saw as a waste of time, you delivered that one-page summary. Most bosses have a range of stylistic imperatives, some of which they believe are core to their success, and it's the ability to figure those out within the first few weeks of working for the new boss, either through observation, by asking former colleagues, or asking the boss directly. On talent acceleration, we go into great depth about kind of all the different dimensions that were critical to a boss, and particularly, so the better bosses are watching you in terms of your ability to develop your team, to make some difficult choices about individuals, and then to motivate them to achieve their outcomes. But just at the same time, of course, your subordinates are looking forward to their own development and want to work for a great boss. So I'm going to focus in on two dimensions. There are quite a number of these that we capture in the book. The first is C players. When high potentials step into a new situation, they fairly quickly, within a few weeks, do a rigorous assessment of who do I have, who have I inherited, and looking at kind of the strengths and gaps, and then any dilemmas they face. They tend to be very aggressive around C players, and they are thoughtful about the fact there are three types of C players. There's the C player who basically has been promoted way beyond their competence level, often may not be highly motivated. There's a C player who's a mismatch with the role they're in or the assignment they're on. And sometimes they're a mismatch stylistically with a prior boss, or they're potentially a mismatch with you stylistically, and that will create kind of a vicious cycle in terms of their performance. And the third are C players who actually are very good at delivering on the numbers and whatever outcomes they have, but they are by nature abrasive or abusive individuals, so they're lacking in emotional intelligence. And our high posts really tend to be terrific at sorting these individuals very quickly in the first few weeks into the three categories. They're thoughtful about coaching each, but when the C player is in that first category, and after a few months of holding them to fairly rigorous but measurable outcomes to which they don't deliver, they find ways to move them out. The second group, they actually are very thoughtful about reassigning them or moving them to roles or projects that fit better their strengths. And with the third group, the ones who are lacking in EQ, they will spend time coaching them, but also laying out to them very clearly the career consequences if they don't change their behavior. That said, generally speaking, that third group is a difficult group to change and to get to buy in. And so oftentimes they move aggressively and move them out of the organization. So their ability to tackle the difficult people or the poor performing people within the first few months of an assignment become an important differentiator. And as you can imagine, as they move out C players who are perennial C players, it begins to lift the motivation of the entire group. The best of these individuals on the high potential side of talent accelerating are developmentally focused, and I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to watch them in action, because as somebody in the leadership development field, you appreciate their emphasis on learning. And you see them build in development activities into their schedules. And these are activities not just for them, but for their teams. They're also very good about making themselves vulnerable in terms of sharing weaknesses that aren't central to their role as leaders, but weaknesses that subordinates can help them with and push the team higher. With few exceptions, most of them tell the group what they're working on to be a more effective leader, and will solicit feedback from their subordinates along the way. And then they're very good about understanding the fact that they sit in the spotlight of attention. So a simple example of this would be one manager who's very action-oriented walked into his new team on the first day, and he noticed that most people were on the phone. And during the meeting, they would be texting, and so they were not completely there. So what he decided to do is the second meeting, he left his phone at his desk, came in phoneless, and announced to the group that he'd observed the fact that no one, people's attention span was seemingly very short, and that whoever was showing a point of view was competing against text messages and all sorts of things, and that from that moment on, he would not bring his own phone into the meeting. So they understand they're in a spotlight that they leverage very consistently and conscientiously. Career piloting. So as I mentioned, high potentials are moving generally at a faster rate, and they're moving across contexts or across different environments. So because they're seen as having the potential to move up to senior levels, they might be given a turnaround, they might be given a growth situation, they might be given a stable market, they might be given a very difficult client, they might be given an operation with serious safety issues, they might be asked to do government affairs. They might have come up through marketing, and next thing you know, they're asked to be a company controller. So what they have to be skillful at is, in a way, letting go. And there was a study done at the Harvard Business School in which they were looking at change agents and people put into very large new roles. And what the study showed was that as you stepped into a new assignment, you tended to consistently fall back on your strengths. In other words, what made you successful in the last role. So if you were particularly skillful at putting together a social media campaign in the last role, your tendency was to fall back into that set of activities in the next role ahead. Now, that said, the next role ahead, actually, the primary demand might be face-to-face client relationships. And what we found was that the high potentials, the ones who had the long-haul high potential, were very good about assessing before they stepped into the new role what new activities they needed to focus on and who they might draw upon in order to be adaptive. And we saw many of them kind of internally ask themselves kind of three core questions, which was, how might my prior experience potentially blindside me in this new assignment? So they were very thoughtful about the blockers that could be created by a past success. They also asked themselves, where might I, that should be fail to pay attention, because I just don't have sufficient experience. And so they were almost to a person very adept at seeking out people with the experiences and depth of knowledge they lacked in a new assignment. And by the way, they often met with these individuals before even stepping into that assignment. The best of them also were very good about thinking about when should I say no to a potential assignment. And Alan and I cataloged a couple of the places as to where you and I should probably say no, even though these are assignments which are often given to high potentials because they seem to be intractable problems, or they're problems where many have failed. And so there's a sense that the high potential leader is going to be the fix, the magic bullet that will solve this. In the book, we talk about how to do a thorough assessment of these assignments, but I will tell you that they tend to have a couple characteristics. One where the business is in very steep decline, and past efforts to turn it around have clearly not pulled the airplane out of its descent. Where the issue is steeped in political warfare, and it's fairly clear that only one side will win over the long run. And it's not clear whether you're on that side or the wrong side, but even if you do win, there are legacy issues that you will face later. The third assignment where you probably should say no is where the issue or initiative is at the edge of your organization's future. And that initiative threatens the core business. So that you basically might be given some resources to pull this off because it's seen as important, but basically the core will figure out clever ways to stall that initiative and sometimes sabotage it. And the final one is working with highly dysfunctional bosses, where you just see the fact that individuals go in under that boss who are high potentials and they come out without the designation. So again, as I mentioned in the book, we talk more about those qualities that you need to assess, but also more importantly, how you get yourself out of those assignments, how you say no, because there's a tendency to say yes, given the fact that this is pretty appealing. I might be the one who can do this. I might be the one who can pull it off. But we see consistently that going into those kinds of assignments, you usually lose the designation, and potentially your credibility can be harmed for a very long period of time, and in the worst case, you can actually be let go. Complexity translating, this is absolutely critical X factor as you rise to the mid and senior levels of the organization. And in some ways, I would argue this is often one of the most foundational criteria to become a CEO. As you can imagine, high potentials are being put into very challenging assignments, and they have to sell. They have to sell initiatives. They have to sell bosses on funding. They have to sell bosses on getting certain people, on getting rid of certain people. And your ability to make sense of this complexity and then persuade key stakeholders is very, very important. In addition, the best leaders, as you can appreciate, have great clarity around organizational priorities. And so part of complexity translating is bringing a sense of clarity to what has to be accomplished in what time frame and why that's important. In addition, we found that in the era of big data, this is becoming even more important. And while the analytical tools are there, it still depends upon human beings to translate that data in meaningful ways. The other quality we identified, and which we describe in some depth in the book, is the ability to turn much of the translation into narratives that are very compelling, really set a sense of our options, and are persuasive. So we found that many of their peers didn't have this skill set in terms of crafting narratives. And that proves to be very important, again, as you move to the mid and upper levels of your organization. We saw people who had a couple of the other X factors, but because they didn't possess complexity translating, they were seen as too much of a specialist or too much of an expert, and would lose their way as they presented lots of details about an issue and could not hold the attention of a CEO or board member or a senior vice president. So this is a critical skill that kicks in as you get to the mid-level. Catalytic learning. Catalytic learning. Well, you'll see I've got this wonderful book cover called Ego is the Enemy. And I think when I think of the high potentials I've interviewed and met and worked with, they all have this wonderful ability to keep their ego in check. They have lots of ego, by the way, but they don't allow that to stop them from learning. And the story which I'd use to capture this quality is a story from a Tibet, which is a young monk who wants to be enlightened, goes to his abbot of the monastery and says to his abbot, you know, I really would like to achieve enlightenment, and do I need an ego to do that? And the abbot smiles and actually starts to laugh a little bit and then says, well, of course you have to have an ego. I mean, the whole idea that you think you could be enlightened, which is almost impossible to obtain, you have to have an ego to believe that. And then the abbot puts on a very soft smile and he says, but if you want to be enlightened, you'll have to give up that ego in order to attain enlightenment. And in a strange way, that story captures this quality of these individuals in the sense that they have the confidence to go into very challenging situations, but they have the humility to know that each of these situations is going to demand a lot of learning on their part. And I think what I'm consistently impressed by is their ability to build learning into their activities. I'm going to share with you the story of Rebecca Halstead, who became one of the first women generals in the United States military. At the high point of her career, she was a brigadier general, and she oversaw 20,000 military and 5,000 civilian personnel. And Rebecca is quite remarkable. She keeps a notebook, or several notebooks, but she keeps a notebook for reflections. And at the end of each day, she asks herself 3 questions. What went well today? What, if anything, did not work? And what have I learned? With her own team throughout her career, she would always do an end-of-day after-action review of initiatives. She was very proactive in soliciting feedback around any major issue that had to be thought through with her team. And like a good talent accelerator, she had as her core philosophy that her success would only be defined by how successful she made the people who worked for her. And so Rebecca illustrates this idea of building into your day lots of opportunities for reflection and learning as routines. The other thing which I would say about the catalytic learning dimension is these are individuals who often go beyond the norm in terms of initiative. So one individual we studied named Vinit, who is in India, who at the time worked for Synthesis, which is a Swiss medical equipment company, was invited to a conference in the United States. It was a global conference of individuals in his role across the world. And the conference itself was 2 days, but he arrived a week early. And why he arrived a week early was he had heard that the sales force in the United States really was an outstanding sales organization. And so he took the 5 days to go on sales calls with different individuals and spend time learning what that organization did. He then, on the flight back to India, created 2 things. One was a sales competency model for his organization in India. And second is he outlined a sales training program that incorporated the lessons he learned from studying the American operations. Nobody asked him to do this. He was the only one in his role who did this across the globe. And Rebecca and Vinit represent this ability to be thoughtful, consistent learners and go beyond expectations in terms of taking observations and lessons and turning them into initiatives. And for this reason, both of these individuals went on to become very successful, fast-track high potentials in their organization. So at this point, I've shared with you kind of what it takes to be a high potential leader over the long term. But you might be asking yourself, well, how would I fall off that list? And I would tell you, in the best organizations, you do fall on and off. As I mentioned earlier, the designation should be dynamic. So that if you have a bad boss for 2 years and they pull you off the list, you can get back on. Or if you actually prove not to be competent at a certain level, you don't stay on and become a mediocre C player for the organization. So I'm going to share with you some of the key ways you lose your status. The first is pretty obvious, and that is you consistently underperform. And this becomes more and more apparent, of course, as you go higher. And depending on the tolerance of your organization for underperformers, you might only need 6 to 12 months to fall off the list. Number two, you clash with your current boss, and this is that style imperative. And we did see people who were promoted to a boss with an extremely different style, which the high potential felt was not the appropriate style. And so they ended up clashing within the first, literally, 3 months, and very quickly then fell out of favor. So back to situation sensing. Your direct reports and peers don't enjoy working with you, and make that known to your boss and potentially their bosses. This is, in many ways, the C player who gets the numbers but is not good at emotional intelligence. Number four was quite, in some ways not surprising, but on the other hand quite surprising in the sense that, as I mentioned, you need a lot of confidence. But this is this ego idea that if you're too self-serving, this becomes apparent to your peers, potentially becomes apparent to the boss, but not always. It's more often the subordinates and peers see this, and word does get out that you're a solo actor. Depending on the function, you could go quite a ways with this, like in a sales function where you're able to bring in many clients. But we did find that over the long haul, this actually often derails a person. You lack executive presence. Now, this is a tricky one because, as you know, that's usually a poorly defined in terms of what exactly is executive presence. And we found that in some organizations that had to do with something as simple as how you dressed and your demeanor in meetings. In other cases, it was your ability to lack complexity translating skills. You simply went into too much detail and superiors lost track of what you were trying to present. Emotional control proved to be a derailer. And then naivete about politics. So these are all some of the kind of factors which can cause you to drop off the list. The other thing which became very clear, because Ellen and I are very familiar with lots of different organizations, get to see the variations in culture, is that the power of culture could amplify you in terms of your high potential status, or actually derail you in terms of your high potential status. And this became particularly important as you're moving across groups from one function to another, or as you move across organizations. And I've called out the 5 most fundamental dimensions that you need to assess before you step into a new role outside of your function, or you need to assess before you step into a new organization. And I'll simplify all of these. We describe them in much more detail in the book, and we also give you checklists to think about kind of a more thorough assessment of these dynamics. So in some organizations, face-to-face meetings are crucial. They also expect you in the first few months on the job to literally network, get to know people, and there's a social component often to this side. It's not just work. In other organizations, you can jump in and you basically can work with people who you never meet, and you can send them emails and video conference and text. And so the relationship dynamics vary widely. And that's also potentially a function of the types of businesses people are in. But your ability to read that quickly becomes critical. So if you're a person who steps into an organization coming from one where you don't have to have a lot of face-to-face relationship building, and suddenly you're in a highly collaborative organization where they expect you to take the first few months to know people, and you don't do that, that will actually typecast you in negative ways. Communications become key. In some organizations, communicating is informal. In others, it's quite formal, presentation decks. In others, you can communicate with your boss's boss. In other organizations, you have to get permission to do that. So communications is a broad area, but it tends to show itself up in communications upwards and what's permissible and what's not, and in meetings in terms of what's permissible, how formal or informal. Decision making, here we go back to the issue of how are decisions taken. In some organizations, decisions are taken before any formal meeting, in pre-meetings and post-meetings. And in other organizations, that's seen as too political. And pre-meetings, if you did a lot of pre-meetings in certain cultures, you'll be typecast as a manipulative person. So understanding what are the preferred ways of taking decisions is key. Individual versus collective orientation, well, to some extent this can match up with the relationship dynamics, but this is, of course, you best determine through your performance reviews and performance rewards, where in some organizations the team is rewarded and recognized, in others it's more the individual, and figuring that out quickly is key. The final one is orientation towards change. It's really interesting and not so surprising for most of us that many high potentials are brought in to turn around bad situations. And what we found, of course, is if the culture is one that's highly relational and highly collaborative and highly consensual, if you come in with an individualistic, I'm here to tell you what to do, you will probably not survive long. And so you need to read pretty quickly what is the organization's kind of cultural emphasis here. So these are 5 very important dynamics that play themselves out in high potential assessments beyond our X factors. I'm going to conclude by sharing with you a quote from Jeffrey Immelt, who stepped down as CEO of General Electric. And he was reflecting on why they chose John Flannery. And it was very interesting because in the Financial Times article, it didn't speak quite a lot about John's background. He said, look, we didn't put John Flannery in place as our CEO for what he knows. We put him in place for how fast we think he can learn. And so I wanted to conclude with that because I think that's our catalytic learning dimension as well as our career piloting dimension. And even when you step into the CEO role, those demands never stop. And so as you think about yourself as a high potential talent, the question I'd ask all of us, myself included, is where do I need to be learning now? In what ways do I need to adapt myself? And where and how should I go to get mastery and learning to do those things? Because it's clear that the only constant today is change. And so we want to understand those important dynamics. We have time for a few questions, if anyone has any questions. And so I'll take just a moment to see if there are questions.
Oh, I see a raised hand from Wilbert, so I will unmute him.
All right. Thanks, Nora.
Wilbert?
Hi, good morning, and thank you, Dr. Conger, for the training. I just wanted to ask a quick question about emotional intelligence, and if you cover that in your in the book, the importance of emotional intelligence for effective leadership.
Yeah, Wilbert, we do. We talk about, particularly in the talent accelerating area, but also catalytic learning, because as you appreciate, being able to be reflective in terms of your behavior is very, very important. And so that story I shared with you about Rebecca Halstead, the Brigadier General, is a very good example where these leaders really have a lot of emotional intelligence into themselves, as well as their ability to read their direct reports and bosses. So, yeah, and we identify kind of some critical areas of EQ that high potentials need to be particularly skillful at, along with some assessment questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have a question from Marilyn. Let's see. She did type it in the chat box.
Marilyn, I see. Let's see. So, Jay, you mentioned turning down positions. This seems a bit tricky. Any thoughts on how to do that? Yeah. So that's a great area, and of course, it's one that I referenced in passing. And in the book, we do give you lots of concrete advice on how to do that. I'll give you a kind of an abridged version of some of that, which is, one, I think you can go back to your immediate supervisor and say, you know, let me share with you where I think I need to be learning. And make certain that message is quite a contrast to the area they're asking you to move to. So they might be saying, you know, we'd like you to take this job in finance, and unfortunately, the person in charge of that area is known to be a very dysfunctional boss, and so you're thinking that's the last assignment I need. So you could go to the boss and say, you know, one of the areas which I find I really need to broaden myself is in marketing. And I think that while I'd appreciate the finance opportunity, I think the marketing one is more of an imperative for me at this stage in my career. So reframe for superiors where you feel your learning needs to take place. The second one is to appeal not only to the boss, but boss's bosses. And if you have a great relationship with the boss and the new person is known to be a very dysfunctional person, you could have a candid one-on-one and say, you know, I'm quite concerned about working for this person. I've done my homework, and what I've discovered is that the last two high potentials who were assigned to her actually came out of that pipeline having lost their designation. I'm not certain I would be able to retain mine either. And you may not wish to use designation. You might just wish to use descriptions that you've heard about the fact that those two individuals who lost their designation actually didn't learn much on the job, and they spent much of their time, you know, doing whatever the dysfunctional boss wanted. I think the other thing is to look around and see if there's a parallel opportunity that's opening up. And if you're fairly alert to that, talk to your boss about the fact that you feel that parallel opportunity fits you much better. But again, we give you some more detailed instructions in the book. Then I have a question here about, let's see, if your organization struggles with accurate assessments of hypos, where should we focus our training? Kathy, definitely I would say on supervisors and helping them understand kind of the attributes that really distinguish people. A couple organizations have started to adapt some of our X factors, and I think that there are a couple unique dimensions to your organization, and they're unique dimensions that are demands of a function. And so I'm not sure I'd say adopt them wholesale, but I think training people basically in how to do these assessments and how to look for concrete examples, it's very, very important. Ed Shine. Ed, nice to hear from you. You asked how can we generalize these to European and Asian cultures. Well, as a undergrad major in anthropology, I would tell you to a degree, but some of them are not easily transferable. So it kind of goes back to the corporate culture slide. There are societal cultures, as you can appreciate, and in some societies or nations, those become dominant determinants, so deference to hierarchy. But generally speaking, that situation sensing of the boss becomes very, very important in terms of realizing if you're moved from the UK to China, being able to quickly read the cultural demands that you're going to have to adapt to a new boss with become an imperative. So yes, there are important cultural dimensions that stretch beyond those 5 X factors. Marilyn was asking, catalytic learning is critical. What's the best way to measure learning agility beyond observing behaviors? You could basically measure them in the caliber of initiatives that are created by the individual. So we go back to Vinit, the individual I shared from India, who came back with a new training program and a new sales competency model. Clearly, that individual not only possessed the ability to be a good learner, but to turn it into initiatives, which then went on to become accepted by all of India, and then actually some other countries began borrowing it. So outcomes would be another way you could test it. Well, I think I'm at the end, and I did want to close with the fact that I'll be offering a seminar at Bayer, forgive me, on April 18th to the 20th called Leadership Transitions. And this particular seminar is for high potential talent, and it is built around the new learnings from this book, The High Potential's Advantage. It is for individuals who are in those roles or who aspire to those roles. Very hands-on and very action-oriented with lots of application, and really does distill what I've been sharing with you in terms of dynamic learning formats. So I hope I'll see a few of you there. And thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it, and go forth and continue to harness your potential.
And I would like to mention that we can extend a special discount for the upcoming leadership program to webinar participants. That would be 20% off the registration fees, and we will send that promotional code, Conger 2018, with the webinar slides and recording to all attendees. And I just want to thank you, Jay, for the very informative presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.